For me, it's a really important distinction, and it's a misconception that most people have, which is public speaking. It conjures vivid and sometimes terrifying pictures of podiums and vast audiences, and anyone who is nervous about speaking in public will think that's not for me. And the thing I tell my ambassadors, my diplomats, my students, anyone I'm teaching, that the moment we're speaking to more than two people, we're engaged in public speaking.
Hello and welcome to episode 180 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we will air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review or a rating. That would mean a lot to me and also help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast. Help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Dr. Susan Laverick is a communication expert who delights in smashing myths about speaking in public, such as speakers are born, charisma is key, or the podium is not introvert friendly. She develops individual styles and teaches the vital techniques underpinning confident presenting. She trains peace builders to powerfully pitch projects, prepares peace laureates for speeches at UN Rotary Day, trains TEDx speakers and mentors emerging leaders. 600 people across the academic, NGO, and corporate sectors have experienced her acclaimed flagship workshop, Speaking with Confidence, Presenting with Impact. Her proudest moment was being hired by a global peace foundation to develop the communication skills of female peace workers in conflict zones and to help former armed combatants to return to civil society by articulating new narratives. Susan is a guest lecturer at the Geneva Graduate Institute and the University of Geneva, where she teaches the art of ethical and influential communication to future leaders. She has a doctorate in English, completed on an Australian government research scholarship, a first-class honors degree in English literature, master's in history, and is an ICF qualified executive coach. All right, Dr. Susan Laverick, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast. It's so great to have you on, Susan.
Thanks, David.
We're going to get into the great work that you do, but first, let's just hear a little bit more about you. Tell us about your journey to the work that you're doing now.
Well, thank you for asking me. I could be here for 2 days, but I shall keep it very succinct. I never expected to be working in the peace building sector as a communication advisor, but we all have journeys. Life often sends us curveballs. So my career began at the BBC, and by rights I should still be there. But various things happened and we ended up moving countries, and I had to reevaluate what I was going to do. Many changes. I did English teaching. I did a lot of other things within the community in Geneva, and eventually was offered to do a doctorate in English, which I just loved. And as a consequence of that, met a lot of people in the Geneva peace building world, and was offered a job, if you like, to give a lecture on effective communication, because given that that was my background in language and linguistics and at the BBC, and really that was the catalyst that has led me in the last 15 years to this role, which I absolutely love and adore. I'm not in conflict zones, but I am working on the sidelines, helping very brave people who are going in or even in post-conflict zones. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's how I ended up. And I would never have expected to have been doing this if you'd talked to me even 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy how that works out.
Yeah.
But you're doing important work around communication. But tell us why you prefer to say speaking with gravitas versus public speaking. What's the difference there for you?
For me, it's a really important distinction, and it's a a misconception that most people have, which is public speaking. It conjures vivid and sometimes terrifying pictures of podiums and vast audiences, and anyone who is nervous about speaking in public will think that's not for me. And the thing I tell my ambassadors, my diplomats, my students, anyone I'm teaching, that the moment we're speaking to more than two people, we're engaged in public speaking. And so the skills I teach are effectively the ones we all need to deliver an effective speech in public. But I think everyone's goal, mine particularly, as I'm giving many more speeches as a professional speaker, is to be able to harness those skills of gravitas and presence. And really, that's what any public speaker needs. So I just find it's a softer term than public speaking. And I learned very early because I'm a guest lecturer in a couple of the universities in Geneva, which I love. And I learned not to call it public speaking because people just were really bothered. So it's as a euphemism, it works really well.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction because really it's about communication, whether it's speaking to a couple people, small group, giving a presentation. There's lots of ways that we communicate, and it's not just getting up in front of, several thousand people. It's in all aspects of our life. And so what is effective communication?
Well, given the world we're living in at the moment, I think it's a vital skill that many governments could be well advised to acquire. And having said that, I am actually doing some work for a government in July. And I'll tell you offline what that is because it's very confidential. It's not in Switzerland and it's not in the UK, but it's exactly that, what you've just said, which is the art of effective communication is what we're doing now. And I know I don't know you personally, but I like you and I like your style, but you're a very good listener. You're a very good interviewer. And really, when I'm teaching effective communication, that's always the fundamentals of where I start. We're talking about active listening, respect. The message I send might not be the message you receive, and it won't be your fault. It will be mine because there's no clarity or my key message isn't there. And the notion of what kind of content are we talking about? And I think above all, taking stress out of situations, because often in professional environments, particularly, especially the ones I'm working in, people are stressed because time is very urgent. And even in the corporate world, people are very edgy and you're just thinking, just relax, do some deep breathing, because if you can't de-stress, then that whole notion of assertive versus aggressive communication will come into play. So I guess that for me is what is so important. It's the listening, respectful listening, and clarity of what we want to say. And I'm sure you've had people on the program. I'm not denigrating, but I've certainly listened to podcasts where I'm thinking, not yours. What are they trying to say? What is the point of this? And it's just that notion of say it, think it, say it, and deliver it clearly.
So what's your advice? How do we clarify our messages so we make sure that we're sending the right message?
Well, I think first of all, we have to know who is our audience. I always say to people, even if it's they're preparing for a pitch, which might have investors, or a presentation to peace building, investors, humanitarians, audience before content. However small your meeting, however large your sphere, who is your audience, and then what is your content? And I think that is really the most important thing. And I'm sure you've had situations, or of situations where people have said to you, oh, look, I was in this meeting and I really couldn't I couldn't articulate my point, and someone else said it and I just couldn't get in, or I said it and they didn't listen. And often it's because the clarity of that expression is missing, because the thinking, communication just doesn't come automatically. It's a process, a cognitive process. So that's something I'm very strict about when I'm especially teaching or preparing people for interviews, that we can think in advance what might be asked, how will we deal with it? So when someone says, well, why did you X, Y, and Z on the 3rd of November? You can say, well, and you have a fairly rational and articulate response.
Yeah, definitely preparation is key. We talk a lot about introversion on this show, and I think even more so because introverts typically aren't great at thinking on their feet, so that preparation is key, and it's key for everybody, of course.
And just jumping in there, I mean, of course, there are moments when we can't prepare, but I think even going into any meeting and we're not quite sure what is this agenda going to be, just to note down some 4 topics that you might think these are things I could chip in on, or just to have some guide to how you might intervene rather than floundering. But absolutely.
Yeah, and it's important to be prepared with those topics so that you can participate early on and not, not let like you were saying, let the conversation already have gone past you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's too late. I have so many people saying, oh, I wish I had, and it's too late. That
Yeah.
moment won't come back.
So when it does come to public speaking, whether that be a presentation or a pitch or whatever, or in front of a large audience, what does make an impactful speech?
The absolutely non-negotiable starting point for me and for those I'm training or people I'm writing speeches for is that we have to be audience-centric, not speaker-centric. And that means knowing that what we're delivering is going to serve a need rather than, oh my God, I've got to give a speech. And while you're in the middle of delivering it, I hope they like me. Why aren't they laughing at my joke? And I think it's that notion again of knowing an audience and above all, knowing ourselves, that self-awareness conversation. So I think it's really right from the outset, this is not about you. And I say that to a lot of people and they look at me and they say, but I've been asked to give the speech. It is about me. But I'm saying that you have been asked to give a speech or an update or a pitch, but ultimately you're giving information that a certain audience needs. And the moment we lose the thread, it's like it's active listening in a funny way. The moment I stop listening to you and I'm thinking my husband's tapping on some pipe downstairs, and if I start worrying about what's he doing to the plumbing, I lose our connection, and we can't afford to do that as communicators, as humans, because communication is communal, and when it isn't, that's when it doesn't work.
Yeah, and I think that's a concept that doesn't come intuitively to a lot of people. They're there, they think, okay, well, I gotta perform well, but really they're forgetting about the purpose is really connecting with the audience. And, what does the audience need to hear from me?
Yeah.
How do we learn to do that, to really engage and connect with the audience on what it is that they need from us?
Well, it depends, of course, what the purpose of this so-called speech or presentation is, but whether it's a keynote or it's a training or it's a seminar, I think we have the material, as long as the material is relevant to the needs of the audience, but it needs to have a human connection. I could give you a 2-hour lecture about communication and rhetoric, and you would be sitting there, David, thinking, kill me now. This is the most boring topic I have ever heard. So I have all that information in my mind, but I have to frame it with a story. And I think we talked about this in our conversations earlier on email, that whatever the material we have will come to life because of the content, but because of our awareness that people want to be entertained. They want something to hook into. And if it's a story that will frame this really important conversation about why we have to be effective communicators or how this can change a business's pitch, then that is what it's all about. And the moment we cease to think about that audience and dwell more on, I hope they liked it, I hope they're going to really love it. I've done the best I can. I've put this story in. I've structured it. I've done the funnel in terms of what is the best content, and the structure is persuasive or it's challenging. And I find it's alchemy. It really is. When all these bits come together, the catalyst for the alchemy is the human connection. And some people don't ever get that.
Yeah. Yes. Let's talk about storytelling because we are built on stories as humans. And that's something I actually had to learn. Like no, just here's the facts that you need to present. And so for the longest time, that's what I did. But I've learned that, we are built on stories and we need to share our stories. And it can make all the difference in the world in conveying our message and really hitting home with them. So
Mm.
tell us more about stories and how we craft our stories to give in our communication.
Well, I really like that you, first of all, highlighted the reality that I think we're the same generation, we were brought up to not talk about ourselves. So you go in, give a speech, or give information, and that's finished. And I think it's taking a risk, and that comes back to the preparation. And I'm a great one for preparation for speeches. And sometimes people will say to me, I haven't got a story. And I go, yes, you do, but you don't know which one yet. And
Yeah.
often people, for example, I give you an example. There was one of my peace laureates who was giving a speech at the UN, and I was training 6, and I was doing this for 7 years every year. And she says, well, it's the research which is interesting. And I said, that's pivotal, but we need to hear about you or find a story. And he said, just as you said then, he said, how do I find a story? And I said, come on, you've been working on this project for 8 years. And then he said to me, do you know, I've got lots of stories. And I said, wonderful. Tell me, just don't tell me them all. But he was, because I could have been there until, today. And the story he came up with was so profoundly moving. It was, I won't go into the details, but the reason he started this NGO helping women in childbirth who had no access to medical care, he gave us the story of a midwife who walked 4 kilometers every day to help women in childbirth. But the way he told it to me, I said, I'm writing this down now. Just repeat it to me, because this story was just incredibly moving. So I think we all have a story inside us. And if you're like me, I have dozens, but then I have to have quite a few when I'm giving presentations and courses. But there's always something. And even I gave a very serious example, but I was in Vienna last year giving a keynote for an event, and I had an accident with my dress. And I was so embarrassed by the dress I had to wear. I know this is very boring for you, but I made a story out of it. And I said, do you know, I came with a beautiful dress and I'm not dressed in an elegant way, but let me tell you what happened. They loved it. And afterwards, and they liked the presentation as well, but that human story, you might say, well, that was a bit risky. Did they invite you back? But it's, as I say to everyone, we are connected by our humanity, and we love stories. As you said, it's a need we've had for millennia. We love stories.
Yeah, that's for sure. So you had to wear a different dress.
Well, it was really embarrassing because the dress I wore was just it, but it didn't matter. And I thought, and that was some modeling too. It wasn't about me, because I was just thinking, oh my God, it was okay, but it was about what I was giving to the audience. I had no choice. As they say, the show goes on, but I managed to make it amusing. And I just thought, well, it was the right thing to do because they were lawyers, very nice people, but they're not like, they're fairly serious people. And so, yeah.
I think it's also an example that as far as like some of our worries and fears, that we're thinking about ourselves, or you're thinking about your dress much more than anybody else is even worried about. That's a key thing in all this too.
And it's the spotlight effect, isn't it? What we think people are looking at, they don't even care.
Yeah,
they don't even notice.
And that kind of goes into the next question. There's a lot of talk about just the fear of public speaking. Like people are terrified. Introverts and extroverts are terrified of public speaking. If there is that fear, how do we overcome that?
Well, let's quantify fear for the moment. There is phobia, which there's glossophobia, which is obviously a real phobia. Someone just cannot talk because they freeze. And fortunately, very few people I've met have ever suffered from that. And I doubt I could help them because that's acute social anxiety and it comes with very many physical manifestations. But for those who hate public speaking, there's usually a reason for that. Either they've never done it before and they're surrounded by people who are really talented and they measure themselves. It's that great comparison that we do as humans, or they had a bad experience. And so it's understanding, where is that fear coming from? Was there a trigger? And can we overcome it? And 10 times out of 10, doing my own sales work here, it's overcomable, if that's such a word. But it does take a lot of trust in oneself. And as I say, if you go back to one person in particular I was helping, she said, "Oh my God, I hate having to do this." Her company made her come to me to get this training. She said, "I hate public speaking. I get all shaky." And at the bottom of it was a presentation she'd made 6 months previously, which she hadn't prepared. She'd only rustled together. And of course, it was a disaster. And I said, well, that's why it was such a bad experience. So if you forget that or move away from that, and people often say to me, well, we can't always prepare a presentation. If you're asked to make a presentation, you have got time to prepare. And that was her problem. And she said to me afterwards, actually, you were right. It was the memory and the humiliation were terrible. But when we realized it wasn't her, she wasn't a bad speaker. She just hadn't prepared.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, I used to get extremely nervous, but I learned for myself, especially as an introvert, that preparation was key, and that I had to think ahead of time. I had to gather my stories, I had to think about what I wanted to say. And of course, if someone just asked me to speak on the fly, I could do it, but it's not going to be my best work usually, unless it's something I've thought a lot about, like I could give a speech on introversion any old time.
But that's the thing, and I'm the same. I wouldn't call myself introvert because I love teaching and being out there. But I am like you. If I'm asked to give a speech, I will devote 6 weeks to it because it must. I'm not saying I learn it off by heart. I do a pitch. If I'm doing a 2-minute, yes. But like you, if you are in control of every part of that speech, then the speech won't be in control of you. And there's yes, we all have butterflies, and that's great because there's good stress. That's keeping us just before we speak. It's the heart and you can feel yourself thinking, oh gosh, it's my turn. And I still feel that as a professional speaker, and they pay me lots of money to speak. So I must be doing the right thing. But it's absolutely what you said. It's preparation for something very important.
Yeah,
and it's worth.
absolutely. And so that leads into the next thing. You talk about some myths around public speaking, especially when it comes to introverts or highly sensitive people. You have 5 myths. Let's talk about those.
Well, I think the one that I really get upset about is that great speakers are born. And that will cripple the rest of us because we're not all great speakers. And it's important to remember that, for example, Steve Jobs had a real phobia about speaking in public. And there's a clip of him in the 80s when we still watched television, and he was about to be interviewed, and he had to keep disappearing because he was absolutely upchucking in the bathroom. And Winston Churchill, we think of him as a great orator, but he had an inability to express his ideas, and he overcame it. So I always say that great speakers are trained. And if you are a good speaker, then you just keep honing your skill. And that for me is so key, especially for introverts, because they always assume that because they're quiet and they don't dominate, that their voice isn't worth listening to, or sit back and let the louder voices dominate. And I can tell you this, that some of the best speakers, and I just mentioned Steve Jobs, and he was an introvert. One of my most brilliant clients is an introvert. And she said to me, I will never be able to make this. I trained her to do a TEDx talk, and she said, I can't do it. I've been asked to do it. And I said, you can, but if you don't want to, I'm not going to push you. And because she devoted the preparation and the rehearsal, she was trembling at the beginning, and I gave her all the breathing exercises. But because she took the time to devote to this process, she was accomplished, impressive, and everyone said, oh my gosh, how did she do it? Because she's always said she was a hopeless speaker. And I think introverts have that huge level of resilience and that capacity to focus and be disciplined about the rehearsals. And I love it because not everyone will do that for me. And I was, sorry, I'll shush in a minute, but I get very passionate about this. I say to people, if you're not prepared to do the rehearsals, I'm not working with you, because it's not worth it. It's like playing a musical instrument and having a lesson once a week and not doing the daily rehearsal. Do you see?
Yeah. And I think that's a key point too. So introverts, we actually have a lot to say. It's a myth that we don't, because we're always thinking. So we have a lot to say. It's just, we're not saying as much because we're thinking before we're speaking. But as far as, being confident in our speaking, I think that's a key, is knowing that our message is important, that people need to hear it. Even if we're not maybe speaking as much as somebody else, our message is important. And that's been a key for me, knowing that, whether I'm asked to speak or I'm seeking out the opportunity, I have something important to say.
And that to me is absolutely crucial, because sometimes, especially younger people, they don't think they have something important to say. And it's almost coaxing them into a confidence zone. And that's where group work is really valuable, working. And I take classes. Whenever I'm hired to do a program, I can't say, how many introverts are in your class? And it just becomes evident to me immediately as I'm working the room and getting to know people that yes, that's someone I will need to spend more attention and give more care to and make sure that they speak. And it's true. And often at the end of my programs, the introverts are the ones who queue up afterwards saying, it was a wonderful course. And I'm not saying that's because I'm a brilliant trainer, but because I felt listened to and you made me feel valued. And now I feel I can do that.
Yes. What about the myth of charisma? Do we all need to have charisma to be great speakers?
Do you know, that is one of my I was saying that great speakers are born as one of my hobby horses, but no, the myth is that we need charisma, and it's those brilliant speakers who can command a room. But the difference between charisma and presence, they're very different. Charisma is a word that, as you would know, comes from the Greek, charism, gift of the gods. It's that quality of charm, and we all love the person who will speak and make us laugh at parties, or people, some political leaders have that charisma and don't use it to good effect. But often those people with charisma aren't very substantial speakers. And I can think of one political leader in the UK who was full of charisma, but everything he said was, what the hell was that all about? Whereas presence is something we can all acquire. And that comes down to the gravitas, the confidence in your communication, the effective communication we were talking about earlier, and the learning to read a room and understanding the temperature of a room, as I call it, and being able to respond to energy and make adjustments in whatever style you have. So absolutely, there are occasions when some people have charisma and presence, but mostly they are two different skills. And many academic researchers would say you're wrong, but I'm right, because I'm a Gemini and I'm very dogmatic. And presence can always be acquired. And communication is the common denominator there.
So how do you coach someone on presence that doesn't feel like they have it?
Well, most people say they don't have presence. They say, oh, look, because we don't know really what it means. And the objective of my training is to give people the communication skills so that they can communicate with clarity. They can command a room in time, although that takes a while. And the foundational skills in presence are your communication skills. All of those things we've been talking about. So I always say to people, never neglect your communication skills. It's how we talk in meetings, how we interact in interviews, our active listening skills, our ability to let others speak in meetings and intervene when we need to, and of course to be able to deliver pitches or presentations as we need to. Just repeating my phrase there. But anything we learn, any confidence we acquire in delivering a communication piece will immediately enhance our profile, and people will think, that person gave a really good speech. And it's also how people perceive you. And if one is more invisible and think, I'm not going to try that, I haven't got it, then the professional visibility will remain completely unchanged.
So when you're coaching, is it different coaching introverts versus extroverts?
I don't tend to work one-to-one unless I'm doing master classes. And I have to be honest, I haven't had introverts on those. But I can say in group classes for companies, when I go in to deliver programs, they just need, as I said to you earlier, when I'm reading a room and I'm getting, that person and that person, they just need extra support. Sounds very patronizing. Encouragement, because they have to move from behind their screen. And they do, because when and I think that's where group training can be very valuable. And people are always very kind, and feedback. I always encourage feedback from exercises I'm giving. But it's true that I never push someone who's uncomfortable. I'll always say, are you happy to do this? And mostly they will. And I have never had someone who has refused because of great stress. But I think empathy is very important. Very important.
Yeah. And like we were talking about, I think the preparation is a little different between introverts and extroverts. I think, because we think before we speak, I think that the preparation can look a little bit different.
Mm.
And I am, like I said, I'm not going to be the best at winging it. And an extroverted friend might be better at that than me. What do you say about that? Can an introvert wing a speech?
I would be counseling against it, and I would also counsel anyone against it. And you mentioned before, you could stand up and talk for 2 hours about issues connected to being a talented introvert. I could talk for 2 hours. But when the stakes are high, never wing it. It's just not worth it, because the things that can go wrong, and the problem is, take that kind of risk unless you're a barrister and can do that very easily. I mean, I could do 2 minutes, no problem, but I would not. If you said to me, Susan, can you do a speech on Friday? I would certainly give it a huge amount of thought, because once that speech is out there, the impression has already been made. People are I always say audiences are kind, and they are, but audiences also expect to be entertained or informed and to be paid back for the time they've given to sit in on a meeting or a presentation or a speech.
Yeah. And I've heard you talk about, sometimes the shorter speeches, maybe the 2-minute speech, are actually more difficult to prepare than a longer speech. What do you mean by that?
I mean that, and I'm not talking about a business pitch, but I'm talking about sometimes, for example, the work I have been doing in New York and in Geneva with these peace laureates, where they have to condense, or no, that's the wrong word. They have to put together a 2-minute speech to present sometimes a project of 8 years. And that requires a huge amount of work. And everyone in the field of oratory recognizes that the 2-minute speech is the most challenging, because it has to be absolutely, each part, it's like a chain. Each part has to be consecutively linked, and you have to have the hooks and the content, and it's telling a story very quickly, giving a lot of information. It's giving a glimpse. That's what I'm trying to say. A 2-minute speech is often used as a quick introduction to a larger piece of work. So it has to be very enticing. And therefore, you'd be horrified if I told you how many drafts I get these laureates to go through. Sometimes it's 7, 8, 9 until we've done this with the funnel. Your viewers or your listeners won't see it, but imagine a big funnel, and we're putting everything into the mix, and eventually it's distilling down, and these are the gold nuggets. These are the gems that are going to showcase, and this is how we're going to curate and assemble this speech. So it becomes almost a work of art. I'm probably being a bit precious here, but that gives you a sense of how passionately I feel about it. Of course, it depends on context. If it's a wedding speech, well, then I'm sure people write their speeches on the back of an envelope, but they do require a lot of care and respect.
Yeah, and it's getting to those gems that you're talking about. It's, you have a very important message, but you have a very short time to deliver it. It's really what is the most important thing that I need to say here, and that can be more difficult to prepare.
And that I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's that notion of a key message. And people say, "Oh, I know what a key message is. It's this." But the key message is the one thing you want someone to take away from your presentation. And if you don't know what your key message is, and it's all blah blah and it's all waffle, then it's not going to have an impact. And I often find that the hooks that are so important to the opening of that speech, and even the story, a miniature story, they often are embedded in all these drafts. So I'll be going through all these drafts I haven't got my highlighter pen, but I have a good editing pen, and I'll think that's their story and that's their opening hook. And so it's not me who's written it, but it's in this wealth of paperwork. And if they hadn't gone through that process of just put the story in, put what is important, and we'll then work from there. And it's impressive. I was going to say impressionant. It's impressive what people can achieve in 260 words.
Yeah. Do you have any general advice, whether it be a short speech or a longer speech, just in preparation?
Yes, I think always remember, first of all, who is the audience? What is your purpose? And what message do you want to take away? And knowing your audience will make you realize, well, are they experts or do they need to be informed? Knowing your purpose, do I need to persuade, or how am I going to structure this speech? And making sure that you have 3 solid messages, because as we know, people tend to only remember, if you're lucky, 3 things from a speech. So absolutely, audience before content, your purpose, and what your outcome is. What do you want from the speech? Because that's the other thing. And I'll say this very briefly. People often forget about what do we want people to do with the information we've shared. The communication is a 2-way process. So I give you a 2-minute speech or a 5-minute speech about X, but I really want you to go away and do something. I might want you to sign up to my program. I might want you to collaborate with me. I might want some investments. So it all helps to really think about it in a holistic way. Again, that very important question: what do I want out of it, or from my audience?
Yeah, that's great advice. So you give a speech, and then there's the Q&A, which can strike fear in people as well, because
Yeah.
what if they ask you something you just don't know?
Well, I've had that before, and the sensible thing is to be honest and say, I can't answer that for you. I'm sorry. I actually wouldn't apologize. I always tell people off for apologizing. But one thing I do urge people, especially when I'm training speakers who are doing major addresses, we go through a process of what I call eliminating the fear factor. And as you say, Q&A can be terrifying if you're not prepared. And really, it is the most important part of a speech, because it's the time you're bringing, the audience has a chance to grill you and really get to know you a bit more. And I always urge people to think about 3 questions they would not wish to be answered, because and that's quite scary, because you think, oh my God, what if they ask me about why did I do this, and when I was at the at this peace event, what went wrong there? I mean, I'm making that up, but to be really honest and brave and thinking, ask those to yourself, make yourself answer them. And people struggle with that. They say, oh, but God, I really don't want to even think about that. And I said, but that's the purpose of this exercise. Let's think about it. Because the chances are, if you do get a hostile question, you might, or if you've been prepared by me, we would already have been covering, not the precise question, obviously, but we would already have covered that dangerous territory, which is quicksand, as you know. You get a speaker who can't answer. It's all right not to answer a question because you don't know the answer. We can talk about it later. But to not answer a question, and that's, as you know, I'm sure, how quickly hostility can creep into that segment, and then it can be very unpleasant.
Yeah, yeah. So try and prepare, especially for those things that you think, might be asked. And then we can't prepare for everything, like you're saying. So be ready to say, you know what? I don't know.
Well, hopefully say it more diplomatically,
Yeah,
but yes.
right. Yes, in a better way. In
No,
a better way.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think to be as prepared as possible is, and the chances are that being an expert in whatever field one is presenting at, it's going to be a fairly safe territory other than those unexpected questions.
Yeah. So much of what we're doing now is online. Do you have any general tips for presenting and speaking online?
Yeah. Do you know, David, I really believe that speaking online, we have to just be more accessible. And we've got our cameras on and our eye contact is very good. I'm looking at you while I'm talking to you. You're looking at me. But I always urge people, if you are updating a meeting or you're presenting something, I always stand up. And I mean, I then turn my camera off and sit down again so they don't really realize. But if you're standing up, you just feel more confident, the diaphragm's expanded, and there's something about being upright than, we're sitting down in our comfortable chairs, and some people's posture isn't very good. So that's one thing. And the other thing I think is try and use your body language. And okay, we're stuck in these little boxes, and yours is big at the moment, and I'm sure mine is, but when there's 90 of us, we're stuck in them. But to be as natural and as real as we are in real life, because that will be conveyed. So not to think, oh, it's only online, I don't have to bother, I'll turn my camera off, or I won't even look. But I've had instances where people have actually, I'm thinking, what are they doing? Are they reading something? Are they on their computer? And there's no sense of connection. And I'll call it out, especially if it's a small group, very politely, of course, because I think, if I'm going to the trouble of being as informative as possible, you want to know that people are actually listening. I'm a bit of a tyrant, it sounds, doesn't it? I'm not really.
Yeah, definitely turn your camera on and be ready.
And use your arms and I was going to say arms and legs, but I meant,
yeah. Arms is probably good. Yeah, and I mean, I have never really thought about standing up online, but you just, you just make your setup so you could do that.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a grand piano. I create my own lectern, and I just feel so much more comfortable because I think I'm fairly, as you can see, well, I try to keep as still as possible, but I feel more comfortable on my feet when I'm standing, because when I'm sitting, I'm usually relaxing or reading a book. So it's counterintuitive for me.
Yeah, so you're bringing that same energy to yourself that you would, if you were speaking on a stage in front of, others.
Or in a meetings, in a group. Absolutely. And I think that's the problem, that we tend to create two identities. Oh, it's only online, I don't have to bother. And yes, so as you said, bring that same energy, very good point, to the online as we would to face.
And so sounds like you're saying treat it the same. And
Well, I mean, yes, it's not the same, but yes, treat it the same.
Yeah, okay. And it's amazing, technology allows us to, we're 8 hours apart, allows us to have this great conversation, and, same, All right. Susan, we've covered so many great things today. There's so many good things that people will take away from this message. Is there anything else that you wanted to share?
Well, no, other than it's been a great pleasure for me to share my thoughts, and I'm always a great ambassador for speaking with Gravitas. And really, one message to any highly sensitive people or introverts out there, please know you have the potential to be outstanding speakers. I know this because I teach. I have taught many introverts, and it's just taking that first step. It is hard, but it's a lifelong skill, and you really are the most gifted communicators.
Well said. I think that's a great way to end. It's introverts, highly sensitive people can be amazing speakers, but they just might have to do some things to learn how to do that. All right. And of course, where can people find out more about the work that you do?
Well, thank you, David. They can connect with me on LinkedIn, Dr. Susan Laverick, or they can look at my website, which is Laverick Consulting Geneva.
All right. And I will put that in the show notes. Thanks again, Susan. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, I've loved it, David, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to further connecting with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media channels. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. If you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there's now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the 4-letter Myers-Briggs code, and you can also have the option of purchasing the full report if you'd like to learn more. I'll add a link to the show notes. So many great things about being an introvert, and we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.